The kingdom of Saudi Arabia is significant in Bible prophecy, and the interview you're about to watch is very telling. All right, folks, let's get into this one. This is going to be a very, very, very interesting video. I think you're going to be really blessed by this. I got to tell you this. We know that Saudi Arabia is significant in Bible prophecy. As a matter of fact, every single time we take a moment to examine what's going on in Saudi Arabia, it becomes a very telling part of a formula that we know will be a part of something that's going to happen in the future that we have yet to see. And undoubtedly, it is something that we should be paying attention to. And so I'm always very intuitive to different interviews that go on. And recently, I was exploring a matter that had involved a subject that came up with climate change in Saudi Arabia. And I came across an interview from about a year ago. And in that interview, CNBC had a sit-down conversation with a person by the name of Adel Al-Jubeir. Now, if you don't know who Adel Al-Jubeir is, he is the Saudi diplomat who is the Minister of State of Foreign Affairs. Now, for those of you that might not know what that actually means, basically, he's the guy that handles all of the affairs of an overwhelming majority of the relationships that exist outside of Saudi Arabia, kind of like what the foreign minister does in Israel or what our Secretary of State might end up doing here in the United States of America. And this interview is very, very, very telling. So what I thought I would do is we would air this interview. Now, by the way, this interview took place roughly a year ago, but it is undoubtedly worthwhile sitting down and examining the contents of what he says. And so what I'll do is I'll air portions of what he says, and then, of course, I'll provide some analysis so that we can develop a better understanding of all the things that are happening, because he speaks about some very significant issues, especially as it relates to Russia. And of course, there are things that very much affect Bible prophecy and substantially when it comes to the area of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Southern Arabian Peninsula, all of these areas that we've been talking about, especially as it relates to some of the things that have been happening with the recent war footings of Israel itself. So you're going to enjoy this. I really do think you're going to benefit greatly from watching this interview and some of the analysis that I provide, and we're going to get right into it. So without further ado, let's get this interview started.
Why don't you walk me through how the meeting between President Biden and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia went yesterday?
This is when Mohammed bin Shalom had a meeting with Joe Biden. I want to say it was somewhere around a year ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. And this is the question that's being asked about, okay? And it is significant, by the way. It bears a lot of significance, especially in relationship to what we're going to set up for in the future here, or later part of the interview.
It went very well, and it was very comprehensive, and it covered all of the issues that are of importance, and that has been reflected in the various statements put out by the two sides. The President brought up the issue of Jamal Khashoggi, as you mentioned, and His Royal Highness's response was that this is an issue that is tremendously painful for Saudi Arabia, that we dealt with this matter, that it was investigated, that it was referred to the courts, and that the courts issued verdicts against the accused. And
by the way, he's referring to the reporter that was executed. Many people, this was on the minds of a lot of people, especially back then. And it was believed actually that it was officials in Saudi Arabia that actually conducted that execution because of the type of stance that this reporter was taking against Saudi Arabia and many key figures in Saudi Arabia. There's still a lot that isn't known about that particular situation, but it is a significant one nonetheless.
Of them have been sentenced to serve time in jail, and they're doing so as we speak. So we took action. The people were punished, and that Saudi Arabia put in place mechanisms to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And the Crown Prince made the point that mistakes happen in many places. The year Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, a number of other journalists were murdered around the world. What has happened in dealing with them? The mistakes are made, including by the United States. We all recall Abu Ghraib. and His Highness made the point that the United States investigated, held people responsible, and put in place mechanisms to ensure that it doesn't happen again. This is what civilized countries do. Unfortunately, there are mistakes that are made by other countries where people don't do what needs to be done, and that's not the case of Saudi Arabia.
It's interesting how he's drawing a parallel between what happened in Abu Ghraib prison in the Middle East versus what they did with the reporter. Again, I'm not condoning any actions that the military took that they shouldn't have taken, but certainly we are talking about two completely different scenarios. But that's a subject for another matter. That isn't the significant portion of this interview, and certainly not the portion of this interview that I want us to pay attention to. But look, I want to say this. The reason why I'm actually going over this interview today is because it was widely overlooked. This was an interview that wasn't even considered or thought about. And let me just say this. I guarantee you that there will be more people watching this interview on this channel than actually originally did when it was actually released. I'm not kidding you. Because people don't pay attention to stuff like this, and Christians especially should be paying attention because the significance that it bears on other issues is really remarkable. As a matter of fact, that's why I do what I do on this channel. I want you guys to not just be educated about the facts as they happen in the current moment, but I want you to be able to connect the dots as you begin to see certain representations or functional expressions being brought forth, anything like that happens. I need you to be able to say, look, this is why this is significant. He said this, and this is why we have to pay attention to that. As a matter of fact, very soon I'm going to bring an interview to the table that was, I want to say, from like 4 years ago. I'm going to do a video on this later, where the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was actually interviewed about this 2030 project that they're undergoing. And the stuff he says there is very telling and remarkably relevant for the current day. I mean, I'm not kidding you. This is amazing stuff. So anyway, we'll get on with this, but there's a lot of very telling information. And in case you have not guessed it already, when we talk about Adel Al-Jubeir, he's a very, very, very smart man, okay? Undoubtedly very soft-spoken, and he is on a whole lot of levels a lot more educated than a lot of people who function as his counterparts, okay? And there's a lot to be said about somebody in his position like this, but especially for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and all of the complexities that exist within the family and so on and so forth. It is interesting to consider where his role is and how delicate his role actually is, especially in the monarchical structure that we see in Saudi Arabia, at least for the portion of I guess, for lack of a better term, the political aspect of it all. It's really remarkable. And what this guy does is pretty amazing. So anyway, let's get back into it.
We have a recent case that is one hand is brought up, the killing of the Palestinian American journalist in Israel. And the question was, what is the United States doing about it? And what are others doing about this case? So mistakes happen, unfortunately, in many places, and the key is how you deal with it. And in Saudi Arabia, we have taken very serious steps and very effective steps to not only deal with it, but also put in place mechanisms to ensure it doesn't happen again.
And I want you guys to pay attention to the fact that he is emphasizing, and it's very scripted, okay? He's emphasizing heavily how much effort Saudi Arabia has put into dealing with the prosecution of the people that allegedly initiated the violent acts that led to the murder of this reporter. Now, what's important here to catch on to is Saudi Arabia is making a case, and they've been doing this for a while now, especially under MBS's leadership. Saudi Arabia is making a case for being a nation that is very, very much intuitively acting in what they would call the civilized first world, right? And this comes from the fact that MBS is very vocal about his desire to want to see Saudi Arabia be a part of the G7. And of course, we've been talking about his role as an economic superpower in this region and how they are growing. They're growing economically speaking, they're growing fiscally speaking, they're growing on a whole bunch of levels. And it's important to recognize that, because Saudi Arabia's motivation in wanting to develop these relationships and the reason why Al-Jubeir is bringing out this particular subject is to put himself on equal footing, or put Saudi Arabia on equal footing with the actions of other nations. And by the way, this will become significant because later on we know the Bible tells us in Ezekiel 38 that Saudi Arabia is a friend of Israel, and not only a friend of Israel, but unlike the other friends of Israel that chose to attack Israel in the Ezekiel 38 scenario, Saudi Arabia will verbally speak dissentfully about the attack. They won't act militaristically speaking, but they will be very verbal about their disdain for the attack by this coalition of nations. So this is all this should be familiar territory to us because Saudi Arabia is positioning itself, and in many ways they're successful. They've been very successful at doing this. They're positioning themselves as a first world nation that functions at perhaps even a more competent level than many of the other nations that they stand side by side on. As a matter of fact, the insinuation that's being brought here is that Saudi Arabia has done a better job of effectively identifying and even criminally prosecuting the people that killed this reporter, unlike other situations in other countries. He brought up the situation of the Palestinian reporter in Israel, which that whole story, man, we could spend a ton of time talking about. And then, of course, the whole idea that he's talking about an actual military prison on the side of the United States of America and kind of bringing in the parallels there. It's not a fair argument, right? We're talking apples and oranges, but the reality of it is relevant to the discussion that he's having right now in trying to project the idea of being a lot more of a reasonable country that does not fall in line with so much of the crazy sort of Arab extremist sort of fundamentalist Quranic or Islamic fundamentalist kind of mentality. So that's what they're doing here. That's the whole object of what's happening. And I want you to see it. He's very good at the political maneuverings that are happening because he knows what he's doing. Okay. And this is not something, he's not a beginner at this. Okay. I think that's really, really important. By the way, I think that should be noted that he has been in office at this role specifically for quite some time, and more specifically functioning as Saudi Arabia's envoy for climate affairs. Now that becomes a really big deal, not because Saudi Arabia is particularly concerned about climate, but because Saudi Arabia knows that it's key to establishing relationships that are much more fundamental and meaningful with larger nations to build economic stability, and even economic prosperity is going to be based in having a relationship with the understanding that they are all working in tandem with one another concerning climate affairs. Okay, so this is very interesting, and you'll get to see this as we continue on through this interview.
So you'd say the United States and Saudi Arabia today are on the same page?
I believe the issue of human rights, for example, came up in terms of a general context, and His Royal Highness' response is that we're very serious about human rights. We care about our people. We care about their right to security, their right to jobs, and their right to healthcare, their right to education, their right to opportunity. And we have our own value system, and countries have different value systems, and you cannot impose values by one country on another country. You have to respect the different values. The United States tried to impose or export its values to Afghanistan and Iraq, and it backfired. Doesn't work.
The premise of the question is Saudi Arabia still getting along with the United States of America? Are they at peace with one another? Because the Khashoggi issue created some big problems. But he's saying, look, not only are we on the same page, but let me give you a harsh backhanded statement regarding what the United States of America has done. Our job, although we share similar values, our job is not to change the values of the society represented in the nations that we choose to get along with. We respect their values, and so we're not going to come in and try to do any nation building. We're not going to come in and try to force upon them values that they don't understand. And by the way, it's funny that he would talk about the friendships with Iraq and what's going on there, especially considering the fact that Iraq is becoming more and more, at least at the time that he started doing this, or the time he was doing this interview, Iraq was becoming more and more friendly to Iran, less and less friendly to the Kurds in the north, which actually meant that they were becoming more and more on a sort of a destabilized footing with the United States of America, because the amount of I think, meaningful relationships that have been established in Iraq has been to the north, where the Kurds are, which makes a substantial difference for the stability that the United States enjoys in that region. And they don't have it anymore because of how things have been sort of materializing with Iran, and especially with cities, or not even cities, countries in the Gulf, especially when we start looking at Qatar and Kuwait and many of these other countries. It's a very significant and delicate issue to move around. So he's making it very, very clear. He's like, you're imposing your values in a situation where you have no business, imposing such values. It's really important that we recognize that variable. Really, really important. Look what he continues to say here.
Do you think that's what they're trying to do to Russia and Ukraine?
I think it's not. There are values that we all can agree on. There are values that are unique to different countries, but we can't expect the people we deal with to share our values 100%.
Isn't it amazing how she brings in immediately the Russia-Ukraine issue? And the foreign minister here, he's very smart. He cannot condemn Russia. And the reason why he can't condemn Russia is because 30% of their military budget is being put into Russian arms. So they have to walk very delicately with what's going on with Russia, while at the same time, if they want any kind of membership into any of the global organizations, they also have to sound very sympathetic towards the cause of Ukraine. So he's juggling it here very, very uniquely. And of course, Saudi Arabia right now is in a much deeper situation than they've been in a long time, because if you remember, just a few weeks ago, Saudi Arabia actually defended Israel by shooting down many of Iran's missiles and drones that they were sending towards Israel. And then Russia almost immediately came out with a statement that says, if Iran is attacked by any country, then Russia would defend Iran's interests. Well, that creates a significant problem for how Saudi Arabia is free now to deal with their own arms that they purchased from Russia in order to defend their own interests. Like, for example, defend their own interests from the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, like Yemen, where the Yemeni Houthis are. So there's a lot here to be thinking about, and he has to walk this very delicately. But understand, this interview is very telling here. There's a lot. We've already learned a bunch of things from this interview, right? We've already learned Saudi Arabia's view concerning the United States of America. It's not a favorable one, at least under the leadership of Joe Biden, right? We've also learned Saudi Arabia's view concerning Russia and Ukraine and what's going on there. And we know that Saudi Arabia is not going to get in the middle of that. And we also know Saudi Arabia's view on the whole mind your own business mindset, right? Saudi Arabia is not going to jump in and support the position of the United States of America in seeking to assume a role that they believe they should have never assumed in the first place. So all this stuff bears a ton of significance, right? And we should pay attention to this, because my hope is by the time we're done with this video, you're going to better understand the things that surround this portion of the world, so that you can make the kind of connections you're going to need to be making as we're watching the materializing of news that's happening right now in Israel and all the areas that surround Israel, especially in Europe. So there's a lot to do here. And we're only we're like 3.5 minutes into a 13-minute interview, but it's very, very important. Like, this is really critical stuff.
If that were the case, and His Royal Highness made this point to the President, he said, if you want to deal with countries that share your values totally, the only countries you're dealing with will probably be in Western Europe. We have differences. It doesn't mean that one is good and one is bad. It just means that countries have certain uniquenesses to them, and this is something that we deal with through dialogue, through interaction, and the more we engage with each other, the more we trade, the more we invest, the more we have cultural exchanges, the more we have dialogue, I think the more we move towards a common worldview. But until we get there, we each have to respect our different values and our different...
Let's stop and pay attention to the significance of the statement that was just made. This man is by far one of the most important and significant diplomats of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, okay? This guy is the Minister of the State, or the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. And he is basically describing to us the need to recognize each other's values. Remember, he said, if you only recognize your own values, if the United States only recognizes its own values, it's only going to be dealing with Western Europe. But he says we all need to recognize each other's values. We need to develop a dialogue, and we need to move towards what? A one world government. That's what he's saying here. He's saying that eventually as we dialogue, we're all going to share the same values as we approach that global direction. Pay attention to what he continues to say in response to this woman's question.
Today, the Crown Prince reiterated that when it comes to energy policy, rational policies are needed in order to avoid further global inflation. When you look at the West's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are you worried about the hit that the global economy is taking as a result of the West's actions? Because more and more sanctions. Now we're talking about a cap on Russian oil prices. I mean, how worrying is this to you?
So she is I don't even think she wrote these questions. These questions are being written for her by the people that have a specific agenda in mind, because she's seeking to drag Saudi Arabia into a position with respect to what's happening in Russia. And watch how the foreign minister answers this question. It's unbelievable. It's like, listen to what he says. It's very telling.
Because Saudi Arabia can do a lot, but they can't be totally responsible for energy markets globally. Yes. There are a lot of different players.
Yes, anytime you have a war in the heart of Europe, it's very concerning, because we know what happened in World War I, we know what happened in World War II. They both started with a conflict in the heart of Europe. And anytime you have a war anywhere in the world, it's an issue of major concern, because it has disruptive elements and effects to it. We have said from the very beginning, we supported the UN General Assembly resolution about the inadmissibility of use of force, about the sovereignty of nations and respect for that. And we have called for a peaceful resolution to this. A, stop the fighting, and two, get to the negotiating table and work out your differences peacefully. The concern that we have is that...
Notice there's no condemnation actively towards Russia whatsoever. He is being very political on this, and he's making it very, very clear that there may be some problems in their view concerning Ukraine, although they're not saying it. Listen to what he continues to say.
Escalation on one side leads to escalation on the other side, and before we know it, things are more likely to spin out of control, and we all pay the price. We've seen the dislocations in terms of global supply chains. We've seen the dislocations in terms of energy markets. We've seen the dislocation in terms of refugees. We've seen the dislocation in terms of food. And we're at our point, and we've reached out to both Russia and to Ukraine, and we've urged them to move towards a ceasefire and settlement of their conflict peacefully. We continue to be engaged with them, as are a number of other countries, and our hope is that they will be able to recognize that it's better to argue across from each other, across the table from each other, than fight across the battlefield from each other, because of the unintended consequences of war and conflict.
Did that come up in the conversations between the Saudis and the Americans?
We have had a conversation with the U.S. about this since the conflict began.
So this is amazing, because catch this. He says, we've had these conversations with the U.S. since the conflict began. So Saudi Arabia, what he's saying is a very, very careful and scripted way of saying this. He's saying that we are making appeals to everybody, including the United States of America, to help us de-escalate this situation, not escalate it, right? And so he made this very, very clear. When these economic sanctions are taking place, when all of these things are happening, we're escalating it, right? We're forcing these people into a mechanism of escalation that gets to the point that when it reaches that certain area, it completely spins out of control. And he said it. When they spin out of control, then everybody loses. And okay, some of you might say, okay, well, James, why is this so significant when we have the conversation of Bible prophecy? Because I keep saying this to people, and I want everybody to get this really embedded deep within them. Ezekiel 38 doesn't happen until there is a peaceful condition in Israel with all of the people that eventually attack them, okay? So the way that you achieve this type of peace is by developing the mindset that this man, this Saudi diplomat, is actually expressing. If you understand fully what he's implying, you have a much better idea of what he's actually looking for and what the community around him is looking for. Remember, the representations of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are going to be an accurate reflection of what you see in most of the Gulf states. It's really important that we understand that, right? The UAE, Dubai, Oman, Qatar, all these places. Saudi Arabia is going to bear a ton of significance in the position that they take. And if they follow Saudi Arabia and they continue to move in that path, then the trade problems that are created by having to use parts of the Gulf or down into the Indian Ocean or through the Red Sea, into the Suez Canal, out to the Mediterranean, to the Atlantic, and eventually over to the North American continent or the South American continent, those issues become null and void because the trade routes are now going to be based on land until we get to the ocean on the Mediterranean side or on the Atlantic side across Africa. But the reality of it is they will eliminate so many of the traditional or typical problems that have come up as a result of trade disagreements, which cause the type of trade deficits that we're experiencing, and the economic failure that's inevitable as a result of war is something that they're looking to put to an end. And he's making this very clear. Like, this shouldn't be a question in anybody's mind, what he's moving towards. And remember, when we read the book of Revelation, we read about a one world government. We read about one world currency and so on and so forth. The full expression of this man's representation concerning what Saudi Arabia expects is very much moving in that direction. It's a globalist mindset. It's a globalist mindset. And so when we start talking about the climate change and so on and so forth, it's the conduit that they're going to use to bring this into fruition. Let's pay attention to what he continues to say.
In terms of the meetings or the summit, came up in terms of the importance of trying to find a peaceful or negotiated settlement to this conflict, one. And two, how do we deal with allowing the export of grains from both Russia and Ukraine to world markets? We have a food crisis where countries do not have access to enough wheat and enough corn and enough food products.
Saudi Arabia supports a lot of those countries.
Yeah, and by the way, we should note this, right? Because China has, he's talking about grains and wheat and so on and so forth. China has literally purchased, within the last couple of years, they've purchased almost 50% of the world's market volume, okay? So you think that this would be something that people would be alarmed over, but they're not. And it's creating the kind of deficits that this man is being concerned about that actually bring into fruition this sort of functional panic that takes place because there is an issue that's created, a very mental issue initially, but then pretty soon it becomes a very practical issue with respect to food supply. And this is a big deal. And that's why Saudi Arabia's role in this becomes even more significant, because if you can change trade routes and you can develop better trade agreements, then you can compensate for what we see China doing and other countries that are seeking to be nefarious in the acquisition of these types of things, right? Like rice, grains, those types of things. It's important to point that out. And he's actually doing a good job with this. And watch the reporter's question as it relates to this subject and how he's going to answer.
Correct. And
like Egypt, like Lebanon, etc.
Correct. And we have worked on setting up a fund with our GCC partners and others in the region for $10 billion to provide help with food security in the MENA region. But we have challenges in South America, in the Caribbean. We have challenges in Asia. We have This is a global issue. Another challenge we have is lack of fertilizer, because a lot of the fertilizer that's sold around the world is produced in Russia. And now you have countries that don't have access to fertilizers, will not be able to produce as much food next year as they could have if they had access to fertilizer. So this will prolong this food crisis. But that's one very important component of this crisis. And there are others that emerge. And so the important issue is, how do we ensure that we have adequate supply of food to countries? How do we ensure that we have adequate supplies of fertilizers? We're trying to encourage more production of fertilizer. How do we ensure that we deal with reconstruction and we deal with the issue of refugees? But most importantly, how do we move towards a ceasefire?
I want you guys to pay attention to how intentional he is being with respect to outlining the global problem. He's talking about food. He's talking about the fertilizer problem. He's talking about the problem of agriculture. He's talking about issues that are mutually shared with a huge amount of people. And it's no coincidence that he's bringing up South America. He's bringing up South America because OPEC is actually dramatically affected by the position that South America takes when it comes to their agricultural reforms. And this is like a big deal. Like, guys, you have to understand the connections that exist between all of them, because if you have agricultural problems, you're going to have problems that relate to how that agriculture, the product of that agriculture is delivered. And when you have delivery slowdowns, you also have demand slowdowns. And when demand goes down, then that means the price of your product continues to go down. And as a result, OPEC loses its ability to be able to manipulate markets. And I do use the term manipulate. I don't mean to be derogatory when I say that, but they use their ability to manipulate. They lose their ability to manipulate markets because of the fact that demand decreases as a result of the fact that product is decreasing, right? So it's interesting because, and by the way, when I say demand decreasing, I'm not talking about demand for agricultural products. I'm talking about demand for fuel and oil, because it doesn't matter how high the demand goes for crop, how high the demand goes for fruit or rice, you can only deliver so much of it, right? So let's just say right now you have 1 bag of rice, okay, versus 100,000 bags of rice. If you have 1 bag of rice, the demand is going to go through the ceiling. Tons of people will be willing to spend millions of dollars for that bag of rice that would normally cost a few dollars. But guess what? When there's only 1 bag of rice, the demand for fuel to deliver that rice is going to go way low. Why? Because you only need a tank of fuel or 10 tanks of fuel to deliver that bag of rice to where it needs to go. If you have 100,000 bags of rice, oh yeah, the demand for that rice will go down because it's everywhere, but the demand for the oil to deliver that price will go significantly higher. So I want you to make that connection, because OPEC has a massive role in being able to manipulate the way markets move. And Saudi Arabia is making it clear they want to be able to have a voice at the table to change the way global markets move so that they can increase their trade abilities, their trade powers, your trade leverage, and everything else that goes with that, okay? So we have to start making these connections, and that's what he's talking about. By the way, this all bears significance when we start talking about a one world government, okay? This is all very important. They're all tied in the same exact way. Okay, let's take a listen.
There, and I raise this point not just because of the relationship that you've grown with Russia over the last few years as a member of OPEC+, but you also have a very strong relationship with Beijing, and half of their oil supplies come from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries. So it leads one to wonder if Saudi Arabia couldn't really be an interlocutor in some of these conversations, some of these problems where you have West versus China, yes, West versus Russia.
Yes.
By the way, her question or her statement, it really does represent a certain level of naivety in her approach to this. Matter of fact, this may very much be the instigatory part of her bosses probably telling her what to ask, but it's not as a cut and dry as she's framing it out to be, right? The complexities associated with just Saudi Arabia's relationship with Russia alone bear a ton of significance. And by the way, if that relationship doesn't stay intact, if that relationship doesn't build from where it currently is, right, then you have massive destabilization in a large part of the Asian continent, right? Because remember, the agreements that exist for energy that China has made are not only with Russia, but also with OPEC and, of course, Russia's membership with OPEC Plus. They all have a lot to do with a bunch of things that are interlocked. By the way, just so that you know, around the time of this interview is when Russia entered into a roughly $300 billion agreement, billion, not million, $1 billion agreement to provide energy resources for China. And that still does not fill the insatiable appetite that China has for energy in order to, or in an attempt to be able to manipulate markets to bring a favorable outcome. By the way, China is the master of manipulating markets in order to bring a favorable outcome. They did it with the help health issue recently, and y'all know what I'm talking about. But let's continue on, because what the foreign minister says here is something I would expect for a man as sophisticated as him to actually say. Listen to what he says.
What is the Saudi role in your view?
We try to do that, and because of the importance of it. We are a player on the global economic system, and we are a player in the global political system.
We're a player in the global economic system, and we're a player in the global political system. He is dead on. He is 100% right. Look at what he goes on to say after he qualifies that statement. I just wanted you to focus in on that. Razor sharp, right? Like get into that. Focus on that. It's really important, because that's going to become the premise for what he says next.
We are a country that is connected to the world. We have investments in the world financial system. We are a big player in the energy system. We are the birthplace of Islam and custodian of the two holy mosques. So we have a central role in the Islamic world.
Custodians of the holy mosques. Notice that there was no mention of the Temple Mount. Notice that there was no mention of Al-Aqsa. Notice that there's no mention of Al-Haram al-Sharif, the Golden Dome. Isn't it interesting, his view regarding the guardianship of what is holy to Islam? I'm not even going to get into the subject of Mecca, but let me just simply say this. We did a fantastic video with Dr. Jay Smith where we talked about the issue of Mecca and Islam. And if you're interested in it, you can go right here. I'll put it up like right in the corner where my finger is. And I'll put the link to that video right there so you can watch it. It's really interesting. All right, let's continue on.
To which 1.7 billion Muslims belong. These are all, we are right next to three of the world's most strategic waterways, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal. We straddle virtually three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, so we are important as a transportation hub. So what happens in the world has an impact on us. Stability and security in the world means you have the ability to trade and prosper, and we benefit. Instability in the world means you disrupt trade and commerce, and you diminish prosperity, and it impacts negatively on us. Wars are terrible. They're the worst in terms of impact for trade and investment and prosperity. So we have been reaching out and engaging with Russia and with Ukraine to try to see if we can find common ground, and we have done this also in partnership with our GCC allies. We have done this in consultation with our Western allies.
Any progress?
Okay, so this is a year ago, and notice Saudi Arabia's official position regarding all of this. Like, pay attention to how they treat this, you guys. Like this is really critical that we see this, right? Saudi Arabia really sees themselves as an economic giant in the region, because they are. Okay, if Saudi Arabia's existence was null and void, there'd be a lot more problems in the region than anybody can even imagine. So like, this is critical. And so she's asking, has there been any progress? Look what he says here, because again, some of this is wishful thinking, some of this is hopeful, but some of this is also like, we're about to twist some arms if we need to. And it's almost prophetic when you consider that this interview took place over a year ago. Okay, listen to this.
You have to keep trying, and I think a number of other countries have tried, and we can't give up. We have to continue to see what we are available. We can't force a settlement on either sides, but we say to them, look, we're a country that has good relations with both sides, and we are prepared to act as a bridge or a facilitator for you to try to overcome your differences through negotiations rather than through warfare. So that's in terms of Ukraine. In terms of the issue with...
I want to stop here because, again, he's saying we have good relations with both people on both sides, and we are becoming facilitators. We want to become facilitators to bring peace instead of warfare. And this makes a lot of sense because Saudi Arabia is projected by the Bible as being that type of character, right? They become the facilitators. Think about this. When Ezekiel 38 happens, what does Saudi Arabia do? They verbally object. Like, what are you thinking? What got inside of you? What's wrong with you, right? So they're just simply falling in line or meeting the characterizations of the Bible. They're like, literally, it's like the Bible got it right? The Bible never gets it wrong. That's what's happening here.
China. We have, we see that the conflict with China is disruptive to the world. And we believe that we want to make sure that there are no misunderstandings or miscalculations that end up leading to the law of unintended consequences. And we believe that the integration of China into the global economic system is important to the stability of the system. And we believe that trade, especially open trade, and human history and economic history has shown us that if you remove trade barriers and you enhance trade, everybody benefits. When you compete in an open playing field, everybody benefits. But if you try to close yourself off or engage in what used to be called beggar thy neighbor policies, everybody loses, and we don't want that.
So he's saying if we all worry about ourselves, then everybody's going to lose and it's not going to work out. He's saying we need to be the globalists that we know we can be. We all need to work together because when we work together, we begin to see growth. If we do it any other way, we're not going to see that growth. This is a globalist mindset. By the way, this is going to go into the discussion of 2030, their Project 2030 that MBS talks about in an older interview that we're going to go over soon, but it's the same thing. Saudi Arabia has or is running towards the globalist mindset that all of the world is going to move towards, and this should not come as a surprise to those of us that study the Bible. It shouldn't. It just shouldn't.
Because we are our prosperity and our interests are linked to an open economic system globally and to free trade. So it's in our interest to try to find or to build bridges between different camps in the international system. Of course, America is our most important strategic ally, and that's where we are and that's who we work with. But that doesn't mean we cannot try to use our relationships with other countries to try to help narrow gaps.
America is our most important strategic ally. By the way, I'm not surprised to hear that be the case. And I think there's even something strategic in making that statement. Can I offer a little bit of analysis here? Okay. And I'm going to make this very brief. I'm not going to, carry this on longer than I need to. But if America continues to be Saudi Arabia's most strategic ally, not just in the region, but in general, and America fails, like I believe it eventually will, especially knowing what we know in Bible prophecy, can you imagine the effects that would have on Saudi Arabia as they fill the gap? Think about it like this. If America fails or all of the Americans are raptured, hopefully it'll be that way, right? But if America fails and Saudi Arabia stands as one of their largest allies and they themselves remain intact, okay, let's just talk about the geopolitical implications of that alone. Saudi Arabia could stand to fill in so many gaps that the United States of America would have left behind, including the type of gaps that involve what happens with energy consumption, the type of gaps that are left with the dollar standard or the petroleum exchange issues, the type of gaps right now that are being left with would be left for BRICS to follow or OPEC Plus or OPEC. Guys, all this stuff is stuff that relates to some very consequential issues that we know are going to come up sooner than later. This interview was a year ago, but folks, it's darn near prophetic. I mean, you would think that the guy is sitting right now at a chair in the current day, in the current moment, and looking at these things. Folks, this stuff is powerful. This stuff is powerful. And I want to bring up a passage because this passage I think is really critical. And I want to remind you of this passage. I think oftentimes I read it to you guys And more importantly, now than ever, it is so valuable for what we are doing in the current day, right? Because if you go to 2 Timothy chapter 3, it starts off by saying this. It says, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. And then it goes on to talk about all the things that you would expect to see in the last days, right? But look at what it says near the end of this chapter. I'm going to read these two verses because it's so important. The last two verses of chapter 3. Now, this is when Timothy, or when Paul is going to Timothy, telling him about the things to expect in the last days. But look at what he said, because I believe this is more applicable now to us in the last days than any other time in human history. It says this: all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Notice this, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Folks, I'm going to just tell you this right now. More than ever, it is so critically important that we stay close to the Word of God, because the Word of God is going to give us everything that we need in order to become equipped to do the work that God has called us to. We are in the last days, and in these days, we need the guidance of God's Word more than we've ever needed it before. Why? Because God is faithful and He's good, and He equips us for what He calls us to, and He's called us to a lot in these last days. So let's open our eyes. Let's look to the Word of God to find understanding and discernment on what's happening around us, and let's apply it in our lives and watch God do amazing things. Amen? All right, you guys, God bless you. Have an absolutely incredible day, and continue to apply these principles to your life, because I can tell you this right now, you will grow in your walk with God. And not only will you grow in your walk with God, but you'll also grow in a real awareness of the things that are happening, and you'll find more and more peace as the days go by, because you've been equipped with what God's word says. All right? Love you guys. God bless you.